Well, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, I'm excited to see you.
Yeah, these are all the students who are taking Applications of GIS, the second course in our GIS certificate. Lee, just, you all have read her biography, but just for the camera, Lee is the city manager for GIS here for the City of Missoula. She has several degrees here from the University of Montana, including her undergrad degree in biology and environmental studies, and then graduate degrees in geography and GIS. In 2004, we had a GIS master's program. Since then, Leah's had a really varied career. Started off after that master's working in the fire center here for a decade, here out of the College of Forestry and Conservation, and then worked for Missoula Water, our water authority here in the state, or in the city, and then when that was taken over by the City of Missoula, transitioned into Missoula GIS and built a lot of the infrastructure that you all looked at. So yeah, that was your bio that you gave me, and you did a really nice job of sort of framing in your bio how you work with other people throughout your career, but really working with diverse constituencies. Can you tell me a little bit more, do you want to go into a little bit more detail about your path, both from your training and then moving in through all those phases, and maybe elaborate a little bit on what that taught you about how to work with all sorts of people?
So when I started, I didn't know what GIS was. I had no idea. I knew that I was ready to go back to graduate school. And I picked up the University of Montana grad catalog, and my husband said, I think you might, look at the city planning thing. I think you might be interested in that. And so I flip in and I look at it, and then right next to city planning was in the geography department, and right next to that was a little description of their GIS program. And I said, databases and maps. I think that sounds really good. I'm in. So it was a little bit by chance that I fell into this career, but it suits me in terms of the working with the combination of technology and data and that data science piece, and then working with people. And how do you take the information that scientists and city staff or whoever it is that you're working with and bring that information to life. And I think I've heard that one of the emphases for your class this year is how do you tell that story. And that really is, I think one of the great things with GIS is because you can make that bridge between that really hardcore data and the public or any kind of element of people that you're working with, and how do you connect there. One of the ways, the things that has been a constant through my career, and a constant focus, very intentional on my part, is looking at the science of data and the spatial data in particular, and looking at where is that created, and who creates that, and how do they create that, and then what are the questions that you can ask? How do you educate people that they can ask those questions and ask them spatially? And the decision makers, who needs to use and interpret and put that data into action in some way? And those are three very distinct groups of people that you work with through the course of this, what I tend to think of it as a bridge. How do you bridge the people that are in the field doing data collection? And that could be everything from wildland firefighters to water service people turning valves and flowing hydrants, to anybody in the forestry sciences collecting data in the field. How do you push that data over the hill, so to speak, and interpret it, help them reinterpret it in a way that managers and decision makers can then leverage that. And so I always think about how do we build that bridge between those two sides of the equation.
Mm-hmm. And you talked a bit about how you built that bridge. Mm-hmm. Your careers also spanned, a lot of GIS technologies. I mean, you weren't doing a lot of data collection on smartphones when you first started, right? Right. So how have you had to change how you span that bridge between data collection, data organization, and then data presentation, while also experiencing this dramatic change in geospatial technology that we've had over the last 20 years?
Second.
So that's a hard one.
There's a lot to unpack in that question.
Well, and I guess I would start with, what have been the biggest changes that you've seen?
The biggest changes that I've seen. Well, I think the phones and the way you collect the data has been one of the biggest changes. The other really significant change is the mechanism for not necessarily collecting the data, but for pushing that out to the public, or pushing that out to the viewers and the people who are going to use the information. Mm-hmm. And the growth in that web-based platform, I know you guys are familiar with the MissoulaMaps.com, but the growth from just being able to present paper-based maps or things just at the very beginning of my career, I was providing maps. It was all paper-based. We were plotting. I would take a whole plotter with me to fire camp so that I could print out the maps. There was no web services at the very beginning. I was pulling data in. I would work at the regional level and pull data from all of the different fire camps throughout the state and the region. And we would do that where they would create their shapefiles and put it onto an FTP site. And then I would come and grab all of those, put it all together, and then make printed maps that would go then to the regional decision makers, into the big briefing rooms. And so I always had a vision for how that data could come in from all the diverse fire camps, that could come in over the web somehow, and then you would present it with the projector and everything. And you think of it now, that's no big deal.
Right.
That's exactly how you're being taught to do that work. So I think that presentation part, the gathering everything and then putting it out through those web services and on the web, has been the biggest change throughout my career. It was,
yeah. I mean, that transformation's been just incredible. Mm-hmm. And one of the upshots of that transformation that we've talked about in class is just a shift in geospatial literacy and map literacy in the general population, as we started having, Garmin's, and then we were using MapQuest to find our ways places, and then the iPhone came along and had a GPS in it. And as that's occurred, people have gotten used to certain motifs in how spatial data are presented. Has that made your job easier, or what's what?
That was a double-edged sword, a little bit, because especially at the beginning of those maps being available on the phones and in everybody's hands, everybody thought that they were a cartographer and a map maker, and they thought they were GIS, right? Well, there's a lot more to it. So we've been through this time period for a while there where we were trying to redefine and emphasize what the profession truly was. Mm-hmm. And on top of everybody's ability to use Google Maps. And so so that was a little bit of a struggle kind of profession-wide. Mm-hmm. But the other piece of that is that people got used to and are used to now being able to ask those questions of a map. And being able to know that they can ask spatial questions and that we can do these really advanced analyses to answer those questions. And that was one of my biggest struggles at the very beginning of my career, is people didn't get that they could ask a question of a map. right? It was a printed object. How do you ask something of that? And so I was always trying to work with the researchers and the people that I was dealing with to educate them how to ask those questions of me, and that they could, that I could give them more. And I think that has changed a lot. People they take for granted that they can ask those questions now.
Yeah, and that also is a double-edged sword, I can imagine.
It is.
Well, and actually that brings up a question that Bethany had from our class, and she was just asking, what does a typical workday look like in your office? Like, what is your office doing on the day-to-day?
On the day-to-day. Well, the City of Missoula and the GIS services is responsible for managing, maintaining the authoritative data for the city. I talk about data in 3 kind of levels: project, operational, and authoritative. And that project data is a lot what you guys are working on, and in one-off projects you're going to ask some questions and deal with something. Operational data in the sense of the management and maintenance of components and assets within the city. So the folks that are going out and flowing hydrants and turning valves and cleaning the parks and those kinds of things. Yeah. And then there's the authoritative. How do I bring all of those kind of pieces up so that we have a central data repository of the true and accurate data for the city that then can be communicated to the public and to our staff, and that everybody is using the same platform. So for our offices, we are involved at the operational and the authoritative level, where our primary responsibility is to maintain that authoritative piece. So I have a couple of folks that do a lot of data entry. They take all of the drawings from the water mains and the different infrastructure construction, and they draw that in to our data sets. On top of that, we work with different staff members throughout the city to work on specific projects. Like, I like to do things that are very task-centric. Everybody wants a big everything map, and that gets unwieldy because you then have to spend all your time turning everything on and off, and you're trying to do too much. So how do you narrow that down and do a task-centric map for any kind of staff member? So we'll work with Parks and Recreation, we work with folks at the cemetery, at Public Works, pretty much anybody within the City of Missoula and staff to come up with and create those kind of task-centric applications for them that are obviously built on top of that authoritative data that I was talking about. Then we also get requests. We get one-off requests in every time. We're responsible for addressing. So all of the addressing that happens throughout the city, one of my staff members assigns all addressing. We'll respond to requests about, is there an easement? So there's research component. Is there an easement at this location? We've got a new development happening over here. So there's different questions and map requests, giving maps of developments or certain specific areas that need to be an exhibit for council if they're doing an annexation or something like that.
So is that taking the legal documentation
Yes.
of boundaries and things and then actually rendering them?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I take it that you have to take that authoritative data set for Missoula and then integrate that or transmit that somehow to the state cadastral, and that's those sort of entities. How much engagement do you have with other geospatial authorities?
And rolling upwards.
Yeah.
At the city level, I don't have as much as you'd think.
Oh.
So a lot of that is the responsibility of the county because we're that little donut hole within the county. So the roads, the cadastral addressing, all of those things that is done at the county level, and then those pieces of information are rolled up into the state, and then they use that to populate the Montana spatial data infrastructure and all of those layers. For my part, I've developed a really good relationship with the staff at the county and my counterpart, the GIS manager at the county. And what we've done is we co-author some of these authoritative data sets where addressing is a great example. We're the addressing authority for the city. Well, the the county addresses everything around us, how do we make sure that the things, they would take the addresses that we assigned, and then they also place the point on the map. They would duplicate that work.
Yeah.
And so we created a collaboration, again, through this technology, this web technology, so that we edit that directly within the county's data set, and then it can get pushed up from there.
And you have to create topological constraints on that process.
So there's a lot of workflow
Yeah.
and things like that go into ensuring that you can secure who can place an address. But
you mentioned, a lot of your role is developing those authoritative data sets for the city. We've talked a bit about authority. Like what does it mean to have an authoritative data set? What does it mean to be the controlling entity? And I take it that was really important in your fire work as well. Having authoritative data and correct data that's up to date for firefighting, from topographic data to you name it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more, because we've got a lot of students here who are interested in fire, talk a bit more about your experience with the Fire Center and in doing fire GIS? Like, what did you do?
Yeah. What did I do?
Yeah.
Well, it was early and it's funny because, 20 years doesn't sound like that long, but it was early in GIS for fire when I was working directly with that. I helped develop the GISS certificate, and that program that you go to get your red book for fire. And so that certification, I helped develop the coursework and the framework for that. And so what that looks like in going to camp is receiving information from the firefighters, from different personnel that would be in the field, that they'd bring you a GPS, or they'd come in. It probably still very much is paper-based, because the best way to communicate with people sometimes with maps is to just have the big one on the wall and give them a Sharpie. I did it 2 days ago with the Parks Department. Sharpies on maps work really well, even now. So in taking and that data, getting it into the computer and getting it into the system, there would be the flights every night that would go over and do the infrared, and so you would get that data down from the flights and incorporate that into your fire lines and everything, then present that to the briefings. So with GIS and fire, if you're in camp, you're the first one up in the morning to get that data down and get it into the briefing maps, and you're the last one to bed at night because you're prepping for the briefing again the next morning. So it's a lot of just data manipulation, not a lot of analysis, not a lot of any of that, but that's camp. Mm-hmm. There is a lot, we all know that there's a lot of fire sciences happening, a lot of research and development that's happening around that. And so my experience with that was a lot of, like I said, getting to the data over the hill. How do we look for and get technology into the hands of people, or a web camera that was observing a fire, and how do we bring that data back and put it into action in some other way? I was involved with the rapid response research, where they would go and take cameras and GPS point. They GPS a plot, they take a camera, they'd film it being burned over, and then they would bring that data back in, and I would help them compile all that into a single geodatabase that multiple researchers could use. So there's a lot of the severity, there's a lot of programming and things that can happen when you're looking at fire severity and trends over time. A lot of temporal data with fire that goes beyond just the perimeters, right? And then studying things like if an area has already burned, how likely is it to burn again? There's so many different research questions within that, and that all can be based within that, the GIS sciences.
Yeah, well, and then of course over the 10 years that you were in the Fire Center, I'm sure there was a lot of science that happened.
Yeah.
And then you have to go through that step that you've been talking about, which is taking that science. Let's say somebody's studying fire behavior in response to wind patterns, for example, and then figuring out how to bring that into an operational setting.
Yeah.
To keep people safe.
Yeah.
While they're fighting.
Yeah, and that's the real interesting work that happens at places like NIFC and stuff, is how do you take the research it and then implement it and make it operational. Yeah, really, really fun stuff there.
Everybody in the class, I invited you here because I had gotten to use Missoula Maps. I was looking for some data, authoritative data, on neighborhoods in Missoula and wards, because I was doing some mapping of the elections that we had over the last year. And after looking through many different places, I really appreciated the Missoula Maps website, how you thematically organized it, and that data were, to me, very accessible as a GIS professional, right? But I could recognize that they were also really accessible for a wide diversity of communities. We've all gotten to look at Missoula Maps. Can you go into a little bit about how the idea of creating that portal came to be, and your process for developing it?
Yeah. Well, the concept of MissoulaMaps.com really was an attempt to, again, make that bridge between what we have as the backbone and where we're collecting the data and who I perceived would need to use and wanted to see it. I get a lot of requests for city limits and things like that. And the other piece that I was seeing is that we had 5 different copies of the city limits within our GIS Online, and they were all out of date because the city limits changed last week. We annexed another little piece of land, right? So that those data are living, and it's not static, and you shouldn't have snapshots of things like that. And so how do I get information in front of both other professionals and the public that is more real time and more interactive? And everything that we had up until then were just static PDFs. And so I said, well, the Esri Hub technology is fairly new, and it was a great way to create a website because I am not a web designer. And so I've learned that multiple times over my career. And so how can I leverage some other technology to build the site for me? And so really the lift there for me was thinking about who the audience is. And I think that's really, really important in any kind of work that you're doing with GIS, in focusing on who's the audience and what is the question that they have. And be it, that field collection piece or communicating with the public and any kind of stakeholders. And so thinking about what does the public need to see, and how do I keep it simple? I get really frustrated. I've been doing this for like 20 plus years, and if I get to somebody's web map and I can't figure out how to turn things on and off within a few seconds, I'm gonna walk away from it. And I know what I'm looking for. So how do I make this as simple as possible for someone who doesn't necessarily know what they're looking for or how to interact with the applications? So that simplicity is key. And targeting the audience, not getting too many pieces of information on any one map. So that's why you'll go in there and you'll see what's my neighborhood and what's my ward are pretty much the exact same map. They're just an emphasis on one or the other, because I don't necessarily want to force somebody to have to know that what they're looking for is embedded in something else, right? I want to present it in a way that they can find it easily.
What were the original communities that you were targeting? Who were those audiences? Like just at the beginning.
At the beginning with Missoula Maps, target audiences, realtors. We get a lot of questions from realtors. We get a lot of questions from city council. And a lot of that is that they just need to communicate where their ward boundaries are or what's happening within their wards. And then utilities. People that need to find the record that is their service line from their house to the street, to the main in the street, and what we call a ditch card. And developers and engineers who needed to see those, I always say water because that's where I came from, but it's water, sewer, any of the utility infrastructure and find out exactly where those are. So those were kind of the three primary audiences that I was working with at the start. Yeah.
When you're building something like that, I mean, you're obviously trying to balance these, as you said, how complex some of these data are. You're trying to keep individual tools simple. You're sort of siloing
Yep.
by application. You also have to make decisions about what data are going to be public versus what data may be displayed, but you might not, the Joe Blow may not be able to get those data and get them down to a really precise point. How do you make some of those decisions? Two of the students actually asked a question that were very similar to this, Aiden and Jaden, looking at how do you have plans to make some data sets more public, and what's the sort of governance structure around these authoritative data sets within the city?
That's something that is really, really important to the work that I do, and it's something that I address at the very beginning. When I start to look at a new data set or even an existing data set, and I need to decide what all the attributes are, what are all the fields that we're going to collect about this, and how are we going to organize it, and looking, I could go on all day about a bit of a data nerd if you couldn't tell. So one of the questions that I ask when I sit down to talk with somebody, who I'll identify those stakeholders. Who am I building this data set with and for? Because it's not me. I'm not the data owner. I might help them draw it, but I might also give it back to them to say, okay, I've helped you build a structure, now you get to go and maintain it, because I don't have the staff capacity to do all of the data sets for everybody, right? But I'll help them design it. So who is that data steward, and what do they need to do, what do they need embedded in there to do the work for their jobs? Design around that, and then take a look at, as we're doing that, identifying, it's one of the fields in the spreadsheets that I create when I'm building a schema, is this attribute public or not? Is this something that we're going to show? Or are we going to filter what gets shown to the public based on this attribute field and a categorization in there? Parks or trails is a great example, where the trails throughout the city, they have a much more extensive data set for trails than what we show on the trail map on the MissoulaMaps.com. And because those are trails that are user created, those are trails that have been closed down, and they've like tried to put all the branches on the trail, get people to stop using them. All of these different kind of braids and different things. They don't want that piece to be on the official trail maps because they don't want people there. That's kind of the point. Or they're building it and it's not open yet. So we always need to build in and identify those ways to filter that information out to keep it internal versus what I show to the public. And then I have to, in that process, always think about, what does my technology framework look like for the internal staff versus what I send to the public. And I have made the choice to keep those completely separate. I have an ArcGIS Enterprise portal environment for our internal staff, which is essentially ArcGIS Online, but served
on premises.
On the premise, yeah. And so we'll do all of our work there, and then we use a tool called distributed collaboration to take those services and push them out to ArcGIS Online. And as I do that, I can filter that out. I can filter out any attributes or features that I don't want to push out. And so, but that design happens almost at the very beginning. Because if you don't figure it out from the start, you're going to get to the end and go, well, I don't have an attribute field that I can pull that data back out. Right. Right?
But
so
I've got nothing to filter back.
Yeah, you've got to think about the full life cycle of that data and that full bridge as to when you're designing it. Because it's very hard to go back and change the schema when you've got a bunch of services on it.
And you're telling us this through a lot of trial and error, right? I'm sure there have been mistakes.
Yes.
Two of the students, Mira and Justin, had a good question, and they were trying to get at this, like, there's some dangerous maps that you could create.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever made a map for the city that got you in trouble? or that got people,
Ah.
I mean, that was like, got people heated. Where you were showing.
Not that went to the public.
Okay, okay.
They're definitely
Well,
internal.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah. And that conversation of whether or not something should be public or external. Yeah, that's gotten me into one of the examples would be snowplows. So one of the pieces of technology that I manage is the AVL, the automated vehicle location system. So the GPS is on all of the snowplows and pretty much any city vehicle will have a GPS on it. And so I had the technology that I could bring that location data from that system, put it into a web application and show where the snowplows are, right? We could do that. We don't because there's liability. There's, anytime for the city, we're running into the issues of liability in that because there are a lot of people out there who will follow and they'll know that a snowplow went down their street and then they'll make a claim that their car got hit. And it didn't really. Yeah, and some instances, yeah, the snowplow actually did hit the car. There are instances where, no, that didn't actually happen. And so I can use the AVL system to prove whether or not there was a plow in that location at that time. And so they were concerned that if I did that, if we showed snowplows real time, that would give those people ammunition to be able to say.
To make claims.
To make those claims that
Yeah.
were, yeah. So there are things like that I have a lot of ideas and a lot of places I want to go with this stuff, and I'll get shut down because people there's too much liability. You can show too much on a map. And the interpretation, there's a classic book, How to Lie with Maps.
Yeah.
I mean, interpretation of maps and how people can misinterpret is very real.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that's been at the fore of regional politics and in conversations lately has been place names. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. We saw our city council, our county commissioners have come together to really want to integrate historical place names, indigenous place names into some of our infrastructure, like Bear Tracks Bridge, and just recognizing, right?
Yeah.
Has that conversation come into Missoula GIS at all in terms of naming?
Yeah, a little bit. Names are important, and names have a long thread of data and context behind them, right? And so name changes can be difficult because you've got to find all of the places where that data touches, right? And so we've had a couple of things that come in terms of Bear Tracks Bridge. The city has a development area out in the Mullen area that's called Swiptip King. And I have worked very hard to figure out how to say that well. And I hope I say it well. And so there are a lot of people at the city who are putting effort into that. In terms of how we manage that within the GIS services, again, it's not my data. I take what they're giving me and I provide them a framework to communicate what they have, right? And so I will we'll always have a name-based field within all of our data sets so that it can be, I'll look at it with that ID structure, something that doesn't make any sense to anybody else, but we need a common name on it, right? So we'll always support that. But the interesting thing about place names is that thread that goes back behind it is there is an official Montana spatial data infrastructure layer for place names. And there is, it extends up to the federal framework. And so there is actually a national spatial data infrastructure framework for place names. And there is a structure, very well-defined structure for proposing and accepting a change to a place name. And while I was at the Fire Center, I helped take the place name layers and propose it to the state. And I can't remember what precipitated that happening. There were some changes, there were some, anyhow, I can't remember. I'm not going to take your time thinking about it, but can't remember. But there, anyhow, what I learned was the complexity of what it takes to change a place name. But there is a framework to do so. And so it actually is not hard once you learn that the framework is in place, and then kind of manage through the framework and the submission, and then there's somebody at the state who reviews that. You know, there's a whole bunch of stuff. But it's not an immovable object to propose a new place name.
Well, and it's essential.
Anybody. It can come from anybody.
Right. And it's essential to keep track of all of those aliases.
Yes.
Right. And in place names where it's been changed, just
Yeah.
to keep track of that, because there's so much data and information out there that may be referring to outdated
Yeah.
names. It's like a complicated.
It is, and it's an interesting piece, because that comes back around to what I was saying before, is you don't want snapshots.
Yeah.
You know, whenever you can do to work on services, on these web services in your maps, and you don't take just a snapshot from somebody, because then you have to maintain and update somebody else's data. You don't want to have to do that. Wherever you can draw that data from the source, you will have the live, you know, if somebody goes through and proposes a name change, but you're using the Montana Spatial Data Infrastructure layer for that, it's going to change on your map for you. And you don't need to know how to do it.
That's
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a major change. Several students. I mean, everybody's here getting trained, and the students who are here in the Applications of GIS course, they've made it through Intro to GIS, and so they're like in it.
Awesome.
And so we've got some good questions about advice, right? How important most students here, I think, are getting the GIS certificate. How important as an employer is it for you to see something like a GIS certificate from the University of Montana, and what's the meaning of that to you?
Yeah. So it's interesting how this has changed even over the last couple of years. So I'll answer the question first about what does the certificate mean to me as a professional, as a hiring manager, when I am looking at applications and looking for a new staff member. The certificate tells me that you have made a conscious effort to learn the concepts and technology within GIS. And so that means to me that I'm going to be bringing someone on who is familiar enough that I can sit them down and say, okay, we've got to do this data entry, and with a bit of training and context for the terminology and for that industry, that you're going to be able to do some of the basic tasks that I need, kind of at a technician level. It is not equivalent to me as a graduate degree. Because of the years and the level of effort. That's not the right way to say it. Just the time.
Experience.
The time and the experience. Yeah, that graduate level is an additional time and experience. So that gets credit for more years of experience in terms of how does that interpret. But it does show me, I'm not going to see your transcripts. You send me your transcripts, I'm not going to look at them. I don't have the time for that. Yeah. But I am going to look at what the education is. And so, seeing the certificate does tell me that you made a concerted effort and that you have the interest in this field to be able to do something. Now, the interesting thing is GIS can be applied in so many different industries, and it can be applied as a professional, and that is your focus. I am going to do GIS for my career. That's the path that I took. That graduate degree, even an undergrad that is specifically GIS, tells me you're somebody who wants to do GIS only. The certificate will often tell me that you are a forester, or you are a biologist, or you are some kind of a scientist or something, and you recognize that this is a technology that will assist you in the things that you're going to do in your career. And that you have the skill and the ability to do that analysis and to manage your own data and to work with this technology to get to the is a means to an end for your discipline, right? Versus GIS itself as a discipline. So that's what the certificate kind of tells to me. I think that somebody who has the certificate could certainly grow into being that person, that is the discipline that they want to do. And that comes with either more education or job experience, right? So that I think is one of the best ways that I can say what the certificate means to me.
Are you using credentialing, like the GISP credential, as something that you're looking for now, or not?
It's interesting because I don't have a GISP.
Well, neither do I.
Yeah. So it's not. That's been something that was very controversial in the field for a long time. I fully support it. I think it's great. I think any time that you can get some professional level of certification, do it. It does speak to your level of experience, commitment, and professionalism. I haven't done it simply because I've been in a position for long enough and I don't intend on leaving.
Yeah.
If I were moving on to another position, I would probably look at getting the certification. But it doesn't make a difference in pay or anything like that for the position that I'm in, so I haven't messed with it. But it can, in industries, it can set you apart. Especially if you're looking at GIS specific discipline jobs, it can set you apart. Some places will pay more if you have the GISP. It gets pretty, you're looking at very GIS specific disciplines when that is. But again, if you're in a science discipline or something else, a lot of places credentials definitely matter.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'd recommend pursuing it if you want. Yeah. And employers will pay for it sometimes.
That's good. Well, I mean,
it's always no if you don't ask.
Yeah.
So ask.
Well, we have a lot of students here who are interested in internships and things like that. So what sort of opportunities are there with the city for internships in GIS? And what are you looking for?
Yeah. So this has been a tricky one. I have not had the funding for an intern for a while. I don't currently have the structure for it, but I am working on it. I'm building it. I want to be able to offer internships this summer. My director is like, yes, you should talk to the students about internships.
Good.
There is one opportunity that has been consistent over the last couple of summers, and that is through the Public Works Department. And they hire an intern to be able to work on a public works specific project, but I supervise that intern. So it's hired, and they look for somebody who's interested in public works or engineering. And I will supervise them on a public works specific project. A lot of times having to do with service lines and stuff like that. I'm hoping to spin up one or more internships within specifically to GIS services so that we can do more project work. I would love to give somebody the opportunity to come in and take a project from, I will not necessarily from the start or from the development piece, but something that I've already worked through, developed, I've got it ready to be outlined, like I need this website created that shows this data for this audience, right? And I want to work with somebody to build that. I also have data cleaning and just real like data entry and data manipulation projects. I'm looking specifically for someone who's good at accessing databases to do a data migration for me. And then the other piece we have that we've developed with the business school is a program called Missoula Data City. And it is an opportunity where city staff and myself, I'm on the committee who works with the professors, will reach out to different professors, different teachers throughout the university. Right now it's just been with the business, but I have a new connection here, so this is good. I want to be able to reach out and say, I have projects. We have city projects that we need somebody to do. Is it so if you're looking for a capstone, we have ideas, we have data, we have formed projects that we don't have time to do that we can turn over to a student to do, in a way that they can turn it back, and it's a product for us to be able to use. So we have those kind of opportunities as well that we're actively exploring, and I would love to tap into this side of the school, this side of the campus, to be able to get more experience.
We'd love to be a part of that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. We've got, I think, just like a couple more minutes. Did any questions come up from y'all over the course of this discussion that you'd like to ask Lee right now?
This is really dry, but since you mentor and hire a lot of newer GIS professionals, what's a quality that you look for, and also what are some bad habits that you'd like to see less of?
Good, great question. The quality that I look for is most important to me is problem solving, and the ability to say, I don't know how to do that, but here's how I'm going to figure it out. I don't expect people to come right out of school and know how to do all these things. The technology changes so fast. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning, is that breadth that just in the last 20 years, how much this has changed. The ability to look at a problem and say, you know what, I'm gonna try this, and this is what I'm gonna do to try and figure this problem out. That's what I'm looking for. Now that's hard to communicate, and sometimes in an interview, the piece that's important is saying, I don't know, but this is what I would do to figure it out. And if I hear that, I'm immediately interested in that person, because they're honest to me, and they want to work, they want to figure it out. And then what are the resources that you're going to use to figure that out, right? There's lots of resources out there. Bad habits. Going too fast and not looking at the details of the data, and not looking at the data structure. I can use an example of one of a former staff member wanted to put all of the GPS components. So you take a GPS point, right, and it comes with all of these fields.
Yeah.
That's not appropriate to put in the authoritative data set. One, because a lot of times that point might move between where you GPSed it and where it goes in the authoritative data set, where it finally lands, just because we do have a visual relative accuracy versus the GPS accuracy. Forcing all of those pieces of information into this over here is not appropriate. So listening and really paying attention to what's the purpose for every data set is really important. And then the detail-oriented part of dealing with GIS and the data really is getting all those attributes right and making sure that they follow along, and you're catching if you're splitting a line and the attributes didn't follow to the child line in that next line, catching that they didn't follow and that you've got to put them in. So really that detail, if you're not detail-oriented, you can cause a lot of problems. The other thing, I want to say one more thing about that in terms of the hiring manager piece. Pay attention when you're doing applications. If there is a form, if they're asking you, and this is specific to the city, what I've learned is that the city has an application form now. I don't get to see your resumes. So pay attention. This is very true with the government, with the federal applications, and now with the city, is you've got to be able to reinterpret you've been taught, or I don't know how much people get taught about resumes anymore, but you're taught to put everything into that one piece of paper, front and back, right? You've got to be able to take that and reinterpret it into the answers of those questions on that application form, and get as much information and context in there as you possibly can, because at the city, I can't see your resume.
Yeah. And people get screened. That's the same at those GS positions, the federal positions. You'll get screened by what you put on that form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So pay real close attention. Try and get as much information, relevant information, into those questions. Don't just copy and paste your whole resume into every answer, because that's more. I'm not going to look at that. but really pay attention and get as much as possible. Don't say see resume, because I can't.
Thank you so much for coming and
Yeah.
being a part of the first Voices of GIS. Thank you all.
I have my business card up here. I'll leave it, I'll put it right here on the table. Please feel free to take it.